Seated. All right. I think we all made it. So I want to say thanks, everybody. I'm Blau. I'm Research Director at Gartner, where I cover all manner of personal technologies. I tend to focus on a lot of consumer issues, whether they be devices or mobile apps and services, but I actually have a long history in virtual reality research and product and software going back a couple of decades or more. And so I'm very excited to be here today to talk to everybody, to talk to these great panelists. And with that, this is a little bit of a surprise for everybody here. We did talk about a little bit of agenda, but first I wanted to ask everybody just to briefly say who you are, introduce yourself, say what your role is, and a little bit about your interests in VR, and then we'll dive into questions and a discussion after that.
Sure. My name is Joe Kraus. I'm a general partner at Google Ventures, and I've spent the last year doing kind of all my outbound research on VR. Made, I think, at this point, 6 or 7 VR investments.
I'm Dhillon Flinn with Rothenberg Ventures. I'm an investor over there. We invest in frontier technologies and the platforms of tomorrow. So obviously VR and AR are both very important to what we do. We've made over 20 investments in the space, and that's a lot due to River, which is a 3-month investment program where we bring people in-house and really surround them with the resources, partners, and mentors they need to succeed.
I'm Michael Yang. I'm a managing director with Comcast Ventures and focus on a variety of sectors, including VR, AR, which is also a relatively new initiative for us. We've made 3 investments in VR year to date and continue to look for more, as well as hopefully finding something in the AR space as well.
Hi guys, I'm Sunny Dhillon, principal and co-founder at Signia Venture Partners. We're a new seed and Series A stage fund. We've only made 1 VR investment to date. Traditionally, we've been pretty strong investors in the game space. So VR has been, and AR and mixed reality has been a natural extension of that for us.
Sounds good. So to start off, actually, I wanted to ask the audience a question. I'm kind of interested to see who's here, and that'll give you guys an idea about the type of audience that we're talking to. So first, a couple questions and just a raise of the hand. So how many here are in the VR business versus interested in the VR business? I was like, who's working in VR today? That's a pretty good group. And the other folks are interested. Who's interested? So we have a lot of folks here that are in VR, been in VR for at least probably a couple of years, or maybe even a few like myself that have been doing it for a long time. But then the second question is, there's a lot of tech that goes on in VR, but also today a lot of content. And I think we'll talk a lot about that on the panel. So today, who is VR tech? Devices, software. Who's VR content? Oh, look at that. So very interesting, all right? So final question about what we're all going to do after we leave here today. So given that everybody's interested or working in VR, if the whole thing falls on its face, who's going to stick around besides me? All right, there we go. So that's awesome. So we have a little idea. There's a lot of folks here in the business. But today, sort of opening question, and give everybody a chance to respond. And I think the main question on people's minds, especially for entrepreneurs in the audience and for somebody like me that does research around businesses producing content or producing tech, how do you guys look at a particular investment opportunity and make a decision around that? So just maybe talk briefly about the thought process that you go through, looking at the type of company, and also maybe touch a little bit on the VR, the immersive aspect of it. So we'll start right here.
Sure. I don't think there's a huge difference between the way I would look at a VR company than any other company. Obviously, the kind of standard rubric of you're looking for great teams, you're looking for a compelling product. Right now, the big thing that you don't have in VR that you do have in other places is a big market. You have the promise of a big market, but you don't yet have a big market. My enthusiasm for VR really stems from I've been an entrepreneur for most of my career, and this feels like the internet back in 1993, 94 to me. A group of highly passionate, almost semi-religious people willing a space into existence. And it's the second thing that I really like is there's still that feeling of intimacy and sharing of ideas that happens early on as opposed to a deep feeling of competitiveness. I see that also on the deal side. If you look, many VCs aren't yet willing to write really big checks into VR for fear of capital loss. So they're syndicating deals, which means that on the investor side, there's also sharing. So those are some of the patterns that I really happen to like about what's happening in VR right now, and that, it rings the bell. I think there is a really good question about timing that I think you have two different perspectives on. My perspective on the reason it makes sense to be investing in VR now is because now is the time that relationships are built and expertise is built. So a two-way street between investors helping entrepreneurs, but also entrepreneurs educating investors about what's actually going on in the market and what you're going to need. There's an alternate point of view that some of, honestly, my partners share, which is, wait a second, the only time that you want to invest in a space, there's only kind of two ways to invest in a space, a new sector. The first is you invest in either the underlying platform, but for me, the idea of investing in another HMD company doesn't make sense because the balance sheet of companies that are doing HMD platforms are measured in the billions of dollars. So then the other way of investing is you invest in applications on that platform after you've had 100 million users. Because if you look at the history of, let's say, iPhone investing, the better thing to do from an investment strategy perspective after the iPhone came out was to go to sleep for 3 years. Wake up and start investing. Because all the investments you made early on were not the companies of consequence. So some of my partners have the view which is, Joe, you're crazy. You're way too early, and being early is the same as being wrong. I have the counterpoint of view, which is, yes, I think the companies of consequence on the application side are likely to be built over time, but we're going to learn a ton in this first round. We're going to build the relationships, and it's going to make everybody stronger in the end.
So we're people investors. We look at the people behind the project and say, why are they starting this company? What's their staying power in virtual reality like? And how has their experience led them to this point? Are they familiar with new mediums, new platforms, and that whole shift? If you're in technology and hardware, it's a little bit trickier. You have to have the exact experience, and you have to be working on something sufficiently different. You know, that's why we invested in Fove and eye tracking and Merge VR, because they're creating a new market. On the content side, it really is. Content entrepreneurs tend to be visionaries, and they tend to really want to build the products that people want to see. They're obsessed with their user base. So we look deeply at that. We're investing all over because we do think virtual reality is going to be like the internet, like mobile. It's applicable to every sector. So we're going to continue doing that, have that same strategy, look at the staying power of the entrepreneurs and their experience leading up to this point.
Would agree with much of what's been said. Since there's not really a market yet, you have to focus on the people and hopefully have folks who are going to be able to navigate through very murky waters and kind of dial it up and dial it down. You know, we're always hesitant when people come in and just say each of the HMD manufacturers said this is their launch, these are the number of units, and therefore we need to go and, you know, grab share and do all that kind of stuff. That's a little bit probably premature scaling, and therefore a lot of cash consumption, which is going to be really expensive. So, you know, we're taking a more measured approach with certain teams that we see more alignment in how they plan to run the business over the next little bit. I think slight nuance on what has been said is we do like when new platforms emerge and think that going early with some of the applications is a great opportunity. So we were investors in Flipboard, which happened to be one of the first apps when the iPad came out. One could argue that app is no different than any other kind of newsreader app when it came out, but because Apple needed to demonstrate an app at the Worldwide Developer Conference and it chose Flipboard, boom, it had unfavorable advantage in terms of distribution. So we would concur hardware HMDs would be tough to kind of compete at a platform level from a venture investor, but getting in any particular application vertical where one of the HMD platforms will prefer you, distribute you, promote you, kind of highlight you, we think that is kind of a great place to kind of be. So we're also looking for entrepreneurs that innately have those relationships and those Rolodex and kind of give themselves a leg up.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the interesting things have been said. I'll echo a lot of what the sentiment that's been mentioned. I think the different area for us, given that we've had success on the early days of a new platform, with games in particular, on early days of Facebook with a company called Playdom, and then on mobile with a company called Funzio and a few others. So it definitely makes sense for us to be venturing into VR right now. The company that we've invested in, that Dhillon and I are actually co-investors on, is called 8i, and it's around content creation tools. Light field technology, cameras facing outside in to create for more realistic looking personal performance capture. I think that the play that we made there, absolutely you're betting on the entrepreneur. These guys all came out of Weta, ILM, Digital Domain, and the top special effects houses. A lot of what was actually done previously that is going to have a lot of relevance here in content for more immersive content was just never commercialized. A lot of it was done in a very R&D experimental fashion at big strategic VFX houses previously. That's only a very small part of it. Building upon that for the different HMDs that are going to be going to market next year really being the year to watch, see how real a lot of what we hope to be real actually is. I think that it demonstrates the kind of thesis that we've had, that the early days of a new platform, further to what Joe said, there's going to be a lot of application developers out there, and a lot of the games companies that we invested in weren't necessarily the first to go to market. You can learn from the shoulders of those that have come before you, and also seeing who's littered the graveyard before you venture forth. However, content creation tools generally are a pretty safe bet from the analysis that we've done and the belief that we have in the early days of a new platform. The downside protection is still pretty solid if you came in early enough, in that there's still platform companies and content creation tools companies out there from the 1.0 pre-VR experience world that are happy to be able to give you a very, protect your downside in that regard. But then the upside is that as there's a surging demand for content now to feed, vociferous consumers that get through the 5 to 6 minute experiences on a 360 video kind of experience pretty quickly, I think that content creation tools that enable you to scale that and make it more efficiently and cheaply is a pretty good bet in the early days too.
That's very interesting. And something that everybody has commented on so far has been about content and having this experience. So I think we can sort of safely assume that the VR hardware, the face masks, the fully immersive head-mounted displays are going to be sufficiently good in this first round to give you a compelling experience. But when I talk to businesses and companies and even investors, there's always this sort of air of lack of confidence that either the content developers or the app developers can create good enough experiences and enough of them over time that'll sustain the hardware sales and bring people back over and over again. So, talk to the audience a bit about what it takes from a content perspective to make that experience good enough, and what kind of plan should those either content developers or app developers have over time to be able to get that return, to be able to get those buyers to come back and back. Anybody want to field this?
You want to go that way?
Do you want to start beside
sure.
this one? Okay. So as a hardcore sci-fi geek my entire life, anything, despite the $2,000-$3,000 that I would have to spend to get up to speed from scratch with the hardware, anything that's giving me even incrementally, marginally upped immersion in the types of games that I'm playing or the types of movies that I'm watching is something that I'm willing to spend on. That's not something that speaks to the wider, broader audience out there, but it does for a lot of hardcore gamers who are willing to be able to either have the hardware to start out with, or they're willing to pay for upgrades to be able to get that added incremental immersion. So I think when it comes to what type of content works, it's a very broad question. In terms of priorities, what's going to go first? I think we've seen with experiments around cardboard and the price point dropping for Samsung Gear VR, I think we're going to be able to see a lot of 360 video experiences for sports, live events, and promotional brand-sponsored material, as we saw with the New York Times recent promo. I think there's great production companies out there that are kind of making some broad steps, such as Verse and Felix and Paul and Kite and Lightning and stuff, that are doing some very interesting stuff. Around the game side, I think one can look at a lot of the deals that are being done like traditional game developer publisher models, like we're done on even console back in the day. Budgets are lower, but the funding dollars are coming from the headsets themselves right now, because you can't really create a VR game that's of a high AAA kind of quality for what you could do on mobile, for example, today. So the funding dollars are coming from the HMDs themselves, which I think is an interesting
Joe,
insight.
maybe you can go next.
Sure. I definitely worry about the same thing. I mean, I'm really honest with myself. I put a VR headset on every day, not because I have a habit yet, but because I'm trying to invest in the space. And that worries me. That is signal of I don't yet personally feel like we've got enough compelling content that is going to draw me in every single day without some alternative motivation, which I have today and that I'm interested in investing. I'm confident that it will happen. So I'm not a skeptic long term, but I feel like the cognitive dissonance every investor needs to have and every entrepreneur needs to have is an undying belief in what will come with a ability to see reality today for what it is. My general view is that obviously gamers have been waiting for a long time for greater immersion, and so that's the obvious first place of content. I don't think there's anything controversial there. I definitely believe that I'm a much bigger believer personally in mobile VR over the mid to long term, even though I think desktop VR is the winner short term, primarily due to the pent-up gaming demand. I think the big driver of mobile VR adoption, especially at a $99 Gear VR price point, could be and probably will be adult. And then content of games and video on top of that. I'm a big believer in video. And I'm also a really big believer in essentially user-generated content here. Specifically, I think this greater feeling of intimacy and immersion that's created for the people you care about. Dhillon and I share an investment in a company called Emergent VR, which is about sharing personal moments with the people you care about. So for example, I have a Ricoh Theta camera, and I take pictures of my kids, and I put them in Dropbox, and my father, who's 82 years old, downloads them into his 360 photo directory on his Gear VR and gets to feel like he's in a more immersive environment with his grandkids. It's a small detail, but it makes a difference. And I think that this kind of UGC piece and sharing of moments in one another's lives and a renaissance, if you will, of 360 video, because there's never been a compelling consumption experience for 360 photos or video until VR headsets. Those are some of the application areas that I think are interesting. Obviously, there's a litany of travel and health and other things as well, but those to me are some of the areas that I think will be a driver.
Dhillon, maybe you can comment a little bit about the user experience specifically and how that could help or hurt. I think you've seen a lot of sort of tech and content, and tell me about how much that content developers and app developers have to pay attention to delivering that experience.
Yeah, user experience as just a term and a phenomenon has really come about in the last 10 years. It seems like people are now hiring for it. They're putting lots of budget behind it, and that's because within mobile and those vast numbers, you lose so many people at every step, at every frame if you have a bad user experience. But in virtual reality, if you have a bad user experience, you can make people sick. You can make people leave and never come back. So that's why I consistently point to the right virtual reality teams are really consortiums of artists and technologists, because combined they can create the perfect user experience. I also lean heavily towards UGC within certain restrictions, because users can create really good VR if you give them the tools to do it. And if you're going to go after the high-end content, you have to be the best of the best. We've invested in Jaunt and Weaver because we believe they're creating some of the best content in the world, and they will continue to do so.
Sounds good. Michael, different question for you. How do you measure VR success?
I want to answer the previous
one.
Go
ahead.
For a different spin on that.
Sure.
And then I can try to tackle that one. So I guess with us, and if you focus on content, we like non-gaming related content. We would say the head content brings you to the table in VR, and the long tail content keeps you there. And what I'm saying by that is we think IP holders, rights holders, the big brands who are in media today who have the franchises, they're the ones who are going to bring the mass populace into VR. So think about Star Wars. Some of you guys here may have already experienced some of the stuff that ILM X Labs is doing. That's pretty kick-ass stuff. And think about it coming out in time with the December movie and all that. You're going to bring a lot of people that may not have been exposed to VR otherwise, potentially intrigued. And all of the fanboys and girls associated with major franchises that are IP-centric, that's what we think is going to really kind of help topple the initial domino. But we also agree, UGC, long tail, whatever else it is that personally speaks to your passions, that's what's going to keep you coming back and make VR potentially habit forming. And we're not quite there yet, but we have a portfolio strategy from an investment perspective that makes sure that we participate on both ends.
So the follow-on was, how do you measure VR success? Not necessarily investment success, but how are you going to measure it for a VR business?
I mean, I think it's like any other form of media right now, which is how many people are consuming it, how often do they come back, how much time are they being engaged, then ultimately is there word of mouth, kind of net promoter score, promotion of what it is they consume. I mean, unfortunately today, the number of VR pieces of content out there is probably in the tens to hundreds, not many thousands, that's for sure. But I think everyone can go around, appear at least on the stage, and point to a dozen of their favorite pieces of VR content. And they were always talking about, hey, did you see that from these guys and all that kind of stuff. We need to get beyond that, but that's really right now how you see success.
All right, sounds good. Hey, I'm going to change pace a little bit, and I haven't told these guys yet, but we're going to have a lightning round of questions. So for the folks that have the microphones, get ready, because I'm going to ask for 1 or 2 questions just after I'm finished with the lightning round. All right, so lightning round goes like this. I'm going to ask a question, and everybody here has to give an answer, and you got 5 words. So think about them carefully. So it's real lightning, all right? And it won't be too many. All right, so when, in terms of years, do you expect your investments to provide significant returns, and why? So you got 1 word for the number of years, and you got 4 more words for why. So Joe, you want to go first?
2020 market needs to develop.
There you go. 2020 market needs to develop.
2016 pessimists win, 2018 optimists win.
You cheated.
That was 6.
You
All right.
cheating. Cheating. I could cheat. Give something like that.
2018 first wave of consolidation.
Nice.
2020 casual VR emerges.
Very interesting. I like those short answers. All right, second lightning round question is, what VR projects should everybody in this room avoid? Don't work on these because I've seen a lot of them. I could come up with my own list.
Don't build an HMD.
There you go.
Don't build another camera.
Don't build another camera.
Work on what you want.
There you go. Sky's the limit.
Um,
Not to do.
HMD.
Don't build an HMD. All right, pretty good. All right. Last one, and we've touched on this a little bit, but I want everybody's top 5 list of VR use cases for this audience to think about building, making, creating. So top 5, you get 5 to pick from. Who wants to go first? Nobody?
Okay, I'll go.
All right, Joe go.
Games, UGC, health, travel, video.
World building, social interaction, casual games, input, interaction,
Interactions.
and tourism.
So far, no hardware there, but Sonny, you want to?
I'm sorry, so we're supposed to rank them from top to bottom in terms of priority?
You don't
just
have
name
to.
five.
Just 5. Top
Okay.
5.
Swing away.
So hardcore games, casual games, social interaction, interacting with other people in VR and the environment around you. Part of that long term is haptics, so haptic feedback to be able to feel more immersed. And then 5th, as a big area of focus, as has been alluded to, is definitely the adult side as well, adult content.
All right.
Hardcore gaming, social, IP-related video content, sports-related VR experiences, and then I would also say news/documentary-centric VR content.
Excellent. That's a great list for everyone here to think about, and these guys, what they're interested in short form. So next, I'm going to take a couple of questions, and then we're going to get back to some more discussion on the panel. So there's a question over here. Do I see a hand? Is there one? Is the microphone? Here you are, right here. Go ahead.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Is the microphone on? Yep.
Yeah.
I kept looking over there.
Thank you. My name is Javier. I have a question regarding saving lives with video games. That's what we do. Right now we're working with Pemex, Mexico's oil company. They have leaks with ammonia. It's very dangerous because it kills people. And we're solving that with VR. We create training using Oculus Rift because people would not pay attention to a PowerPoint or read this manual. So what do you think about solving real-life problems, high-risk problems using VR? Do you think it's a big market for that? We found interest in some companies, but what would you think about that?
I don't personally know the market for simulation, industrial simulation. Like, I don't have a good sense of its size, but it feels like a perfect use case for something like that. I mean, you see that also in, like, I don't know how many articles have been written at this point by how many NFL teams are using it for quarterback simulation training, for quarterbacks being able to look at a defensive lineup and make their reads and progressions. It feels, but the whole idea of training and simulation feels like a great use case for VR, for sure.
Anybody else want to tackle this?
Sorry.
Simulation definitely will bring down, or virtual reality definitely will bring down the costs in simulation and training, but the question is, can it be as effective or more effective? So the fastest your startup can prove out effectiveness and ROI, the more clients you'll be able to sign.
There's a company down in LA that's raised a bunch of money for an augmented reality helmet called Dacry that's been largely focused on working with a lot of oil companies, I think, for training around hazardous kind of situations. I think there's the two things to consider there. One are it's increasing not just for professionals working on the rigs, et cetera, but actually for people to understand the impact of the damage of the oil spills. So I think that immersive, empathetic kind of set of VR is absolutely huge here. On the training manual side, regulatory requirements around the type of content and safety standards that go around that, and making sure that that content meets those kinds of standards makes it a little bit more challenging, I think, for scalable adoption, because you're going to have to create very specific per client kind of production, I think. Something to think about, but I would monitor Dacry and see what they've been doing. They've been around for a while.
Sounds great. Thanks for the question. Is there one more question we'll take before we get back to panelist question?
Hey, so as a content creator, one of the biggest challenges we come across is input, specifically, and the direction that input might be taking in VR. And so far, there hasn't been anything that I've seen that shows something that's really the true way of interfacing with any VR experiences. Do you have any opinions or thoughts on the direction that might go and anything that you might see that might improve input in VR? Because it's mostly focused on HMDs, but not really how do you interface in VR.
Michael, you're shaking your head. Maybe you want to.
No, I think it's a great unsolved opportunity. I mean, is it controllers? Is it speech or voice? Others are trying to do companion kind of tablets or computing devices down here. I don't know. I think this is one where we've at least said we'll let the major manufacturers try to solve, because they all have it on their roadmaps. I also think that any startup or entrepreneur that's working in that space, these are the quick consolidation type of acqui-hire type of opportunities that are going to happen over the next year to 18 months.
All right. Anybody else? Or
I mean, for me, I really like the Oculus Touch controllers. I think they're really well done. And I'm bullish on voice. I mean, if you just look at the accuracy of speech to text these days, both from Google, Apple, Microsoft, I think there's just been incredible progress over the last 5 years, and so I'm bullish long-term on that being another mechanism of input, for sure.
all right, so let's dive into maybe some more discussion. And sort of the first half, my questions were a little bit more about your investments in the companies. The second half is going to be a little bit more market-focused. Certainly, Michael in his keynote speech talked about the market. And he's a financial analyst. I'm a tech analyst, so I have a little bit different perspective, but very curious about the thoughts here about the market, because the investment that you all are making really drive the market forward. So not only from the big top-level consumer platforms, but from a lot of the entrepreneurs that are here that eventually will either get acquired or become some of those platforms and providers themselves. I often get asked about trigger points. That is, when you look at the trajectory of the market, or what will be the market, what are the signs that you're going to watch for? How are you going to manage your investments to sort of match the next level of adoption, whether it be business or consumer, or play up on or leapfrog over that next sort of killer app? So tell me a little bit about what you see are going to be the trigger points and the signs that you're watching for that the market is maturing.
So I'll caveat that with saying we look to invest in the companies that will drive the market and catalyze the market. So the type of content and the type of experiences that people say, I want to buy a VR HMD because this exists on it. But that being said, we obviously think a lot about trigger points and what's going to happen. 2016 is definitely going to be a telling year. If we can convert 1% of the PC enthusiasts and hardcore gamers out there, we'll start to see a pretty big, decent market start to form. And then in 2018, it really has to be, it's about the form factor of the hardware. What it looks like when you put it on, how comfortable is it, how high performing is it. And when we start to see that, and that's probably going to be Gen 2 of Oculus, the other thing to mention is that HTC has a lot of conviction behind virtual reality. Their partnership with Valve is a really big deal in this area, and they're committing a lot of budget to this. So we're really excited to see what they produce too.
Sounds good. Michael?
Yeah, I'm particularly anxious about Gear VR launch and kind of how it performs because, as said earlier, I think mobile is going to be the tip of the spear. As much as the kind of PC tethered high-performant HMD experience is great and all that, it's still going to be a limited kind of number of units shipped. So I think if we were looking for true mass adoption, as was said earlier, I think it's all predicated on mobile. And obviously Cardboard is clearly doing its piece, but we really need to see Gear kind of step out and really crank some units. And if we see that, then I think we're on our way. If it becomes a lackluster launch, then I think we all have to be a little bit more tempered.
Sounds good. Sonny, any comments on trigger points?
Yeah, I think timing from a trigger point of Christmas 2016, just to echo everybody else, I think that's when you're going to see, by that point, big consumer pushes, B2C consumer pushes from the platforms and the HMDs to actually shift hardware. I think I agree with Michael in being, really anticipating what's going on for Gear VR to launch because it's going to be the most accessible at launch. And it's going to be fine and great for most people's first experience in VR who won't have had access to a PC-based HMD by that point. So I'm pretty excited about that. And then the other one is when we start to see some of the bigger brands start to do more than just little minor promotional to accompany the theatrical release. They'll do like a Cardboard app to accompany it. I want to see something a little bit more committed from them as well in terms of stepping up from more traditional production financing with VR-specific production companies.
I have a few thoughts to add on. The first is I want to rewind the clock and talk about the trigger point that got me interested in VR to begin with, which is rewinding the clock about 18 months ago. I was over at a friend's house who had a DK1. I had my then 11-year-old son with me. I put on the DK1 and was like, wow, this is incredible. This is amazing. My son puts it on, and it's as if it was just every day, like, I knew you had one of these at the office, Dad. Why don't you bring this home? So what is amazing to an adult but is obvious to a kid is a really interesting indicator to me of where technology is headed. His reaction at 12 and a half years old, yesterday when the paper New York Times came around, he was running around super excited about Cardboard and being able to take his phone, put it in there, and make some experiences out of it. And he was jumping up and down in a way that I was like, dude, it's Cardboard. I mean, you've played with a DK2, you've played with a Vive, what is going on? And it was the accessibility for him, that he could put it in his pocket and suddenly transform his smartphone into something else. So those are interesting trigger points to me, what gives me the conviction that it's not a question of if this is going to happen, but it is really a question of timing. Now, timing makes a huge difference. So what are some of the other things? The obvious one is when there's 100 million units shipped, that is definitely a period of great opportunity. Obviously, we're nowhere close to 100 million units shipped. I'm personally feeling that 2016 is going to be a year of perceptual despair in VR, primarily because the hype's gotten too far ahead of the sales figures of the projected sales figures have gotten way too far ahead of what I actually think is going to happen. And when projections have first contact with the market, there is bound to be, in my opinion, disappointment. The challenge is twofold for entrepreneurs. Number one, my recommendation to all of you in the audience who are starting companies, 2016, survival is your strategy. Survival is your strategy. Live long enough for the market to come to you. It's going to be very tempting. The good idea fairy is going to come along and put neat ideas in your head, and you're going to believe that you can make it in 2016. You can survive in 2016 to make it to 2017. Please do. The second is I think we're going to shake out some of what might be called the weak longs who are investing in VR, because they're going to have this perceptual hit, and partnerships are going to look at each other and say, why the hell are you doing that? Why are you putting money in? And I think a lot about the cautionary tale of the iFund, a great fund set up by Kleiner Perkins in the early days of the iPhone. Should have been the most successful VC fund in history. Should have had WhatsApp, should have had Snapchat, should have had Instagram. Why didn't it? One of the reasons is by starting too early and investing too much. This is from discussions with with folks and trying to learn about it, partnerships lost faith. And so I think a lot about how do you manage partnerships and how do you deal with this issue of a perceptual shock that I think is going to come when projections hit the marketplace, and managing through that so that we can continue to invest.
So it's interesting you mentioned projections. At Gartner, I just came out with our forecast on head-mounted displays. And it sort of matches, I think, what a lot of the panel says, is that, yeah, it'll be modest, but it's certainly not going to be some of these fantastically high returns or sort of device sell-through that we're going to see in a short number of years. It'll be more sustained and more long-term. But what everybody's saying here is that in this first year or two, these will be the early adopters. These will be the gamers that are out there. But my sort of follow-up question and sort of mini lightning round is, will it be cardboard, will it be mobile, or will it be wired? Quick anecdote, 20-some years ago, I was at a VR startup here in San Francisco, and we were writing software, and we gave away 100 million pieces of sort of VR software. We thought we had it made, and that was the mid-90s. And you mentioned sort of this 100 million number, and I was just thinking like, oh, that doesn't really seem like so much these days. So anyway, so just quick answer. So cardboard, mobile, or wired, and maybe a little bit why.
I don't get the question.
So the VR.
What's going to succeed first?
Yes, succeed first. Cardboard, mobile, or wired.
So mobile and cardboard are separate?
Separate. Cardboard is what you get with the New York Times. Mobile would be Samsung Gear VR.
Got it.
Google has some of the brightest minds working on the cardboard team. The cardboard was an experiment. Gen 2 of whatever they do is going to be really exciting. I'm not sure what it is, but it's going to be mobile and it's going to be exciting. It's probably going to look more like the Gear VR. So I'd say Gear VR and whatever the Android team does with the Google Cardboard team is going to be really exciting and probably be the first to look like success.
All right. Official lightning round question then. 5 words. You guys love this. So 5 words. The best VR demo you've ever seen, and describe it. All right, I'll give it leeway. 7 words, maybe.
That's the hard part.
It's hard. It's hard, but these are challenging questions. So I mean, I could name mine in 5 words. So who wants to go first? Best VR demo you've ever seen.
As a gamer so far, it's E-Valkyrie.
E-Valkyrie.
Yeah. Sorry, was I supposed to say more than that?
Sure. Yeah, E-Valkyrie
it's a
and
cockpit space fighter game by CCP.
Got it.
For me, it's Neos by SolarAx. They're creating a world builder. You can find videos of it on YouTube, but it's not accessible yet. But when it is, I think it's going to change the game on mobile.
Michael, best VR demo.
I'm obviously a Star Wars fan, so I'm going to say any of the Star Wars immersive pieces are fantastic. But people often ask me this question. If you're introducing VR for the first time to somebody who's never experienced it, what piece would you show them? I would actually show them Evolution of Verse by Chris Milk. I think it's a great starter piece in Gear VR to expose somebody to VR.
So I was home, sorry to interrupt, I was home last week with my family in England, and it was over Halloween time. So I got to show all my little cousins Versus Catatonic, which is a piece where you're inside an insane asylum. Terrifying for those of us that are even prepared to what 360 video is. But just the looks on the faces, I got it all recorded of the kids screaming and everything. So
Best VR demo.
I'll go with maybe a counterplay, which is Tilt Brush.
Nice. Sounds good. Hey, so we have time for another question or two. Yes? 1 question. So who wants audience question? All right, I'll ask a question. Another lightning round. Oh, do we have one over here? Great. Right over here.
So given the I really agree with what Sonny was saying, that the hardcore gamers are probably the most likely people to spend money to increase their immersion even just like a tiny bit, which is awesome. How do we, in this era though right now, traditional hardcore game mechanics depend on largely fast motion, tracking, precise targeting, that sort of thing, which has a plethora of, basically it makes players sick in the current round, right? How do we survive, to build on your point, Joe, this transition to 2016 without catering to trying to deliver hardcore game mechanics in VR? It seems like VR is more tuned toward casual game mechanics. mechanics where you're not, moving around? How do we solve that?
I mean, you could talk about resolution. That would be a good example of casual.
Sure.
What they're doing.
Somebody want to tackle that? Yeah.
Well, I think the question is more about how would you solve it for hardcore, because I definitely agree that casual plays well. We have an investment called Resolution Games, which Sunny's referring to in the casual space.
So I actually disagree a little bit. I think that the first-person shooter genre that's kind of been thought of as being the initial go-to point for hardcore gaming, it makes people sick with motion sickness, is what you're referring to. So at Oculus Connect, a couple months ago, they announced Bullet Train is the Epic Unreal Engine guy's new take on a first-person shooter. So there's ways to get around it from a hardcore game mechanic perspective. I don't know if you've ever played a game. So I was referring more to what's going to avoid motion sickness. And there's like a game called Time Crisis back in the day where what they're adopting is largely teleportation. So the fact of you running in the game really fast, but you sitting stationary, the inner ear issues and all that kind of stuff that causes for people to get sick. First of all, that doesn't happen to everybody. It happens like 1 in 6, I think is the stats that I was reading. But there's ways around it. Like, don't make me run from here to there. Just have me teleport from here to there, and then I'm just like, shooting from behind a barrier or something. So there's going to be quick fixes like that, whether it's an issue of like latency and field of view, et cetera, and the tech actually improving to reduce, some of those, biological constraints that are currently in effect. That remains to be seen, and I can't really speak to that right now. But there's going to be some quick fixes and band-aids like I just described with Bullet Train, I think, in the short term. Does that answer the question a little bit? Oh, I understand what you're saying. Let's catch up. I know exactly what you're talking about.
I've definitely played FPSs that haven't made me personally sick. Like if you talk to the Servios guys down in LA and their experience, they do a really good job without teleportation in terms of locomotion. I found the input controls a little hard to actually get used to. But I expected for that, I'm pretty sensitive, and I expected that to be far more nausea-inducing. Wasn't at all. In fact, the most nausea-inducing thing I've generally experienced is when you're falling and then you hit the ground, for me at least, and did that 2 or 3 times in their experience. And so I don't know if they're doing particular tricks, but I've at least personally experienced it one way and not felt it. And I've seen for me, the teleportation mechanic is unsatisfying as a way of moving around. I feel like it breaks the illusion. It actually takes me out of any sense of immersion and presence. Reminds me of Unreal Tournament back in the day of like these teleportation discs and moving around. But so I'm hopeful there's some kind of trick that gets most people not sick. And the other piece is, I think third-person perspectives seem to work better, at least for me, and don't necessarily give me the same sense of immersion without needing to be completely from a first-person perspective.
So a lot of great user interface challenges yet to go. So I want to thank the panelists and for everything else, but looks like we've got to get off stage and go to the next. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.